Hello YouTube, and welcome to a new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today we are going to be talking about the War of the Red Diamond, a civil war within the Empire that took place during the Third Era after an Imperial succession dispute. I did my best to work on decent looking visuals for this video, so I'd love it if you would give some feedback on them in the comments. That said, let's quickly begin with this video. Back in the year 119 of the Third Era, Emperor Antiochus Septim died after 20 years rule over the Tamrielic Empire, which then spawned the entire continent. Antiochus had not been very well liked as an emperor. He had been a weak ruler and a drunkard, and he had a lot of affairs with women. He lived large and wasted lots of money on his lavish lifestyle while neglecting the well-being of the provinces of the empire. During his rule, several conflicts had arisen within the empire, which the empire had only barely survived. Most famously, there was the Marmor invasion of the Somerset Isles in the year 110 of the Third Era, which only barely was prevented by Antiochus' forces. All of this wasn't appreciated by the Tamrielic nobility, who became quite sick of Antiochus and during his reign often came to his half-sister, Potema, to complain. Potema was 16 years younger than Antiochus and therefore had never had a claim to the throne, but at the age of 14 she'd been married off to the old king of Solitude, a man named Mantiarco, giving her at least somewhat of a position of power as Queen of Solitude. Over her lifetime she gained a son, Uriel, who would become King of Solitude once her now elderly husband Mantiarco died. In the same year her husband Mantiarco died, her father, Emperor Pelagius Septim II, died as well. This resulted in her older brother Antiochus getting the throne. And over the years of his rule, Antiochus apparently transformed the Imperial palace in some kind of brothel, if we are to believe the historical records. Over the course of Antiochus' rule, she used everyone who came to her to complain about him to spread discontent across Tamriel, until parts of northern Tamriel were more loyal to her than to her brother Antiochus, who was the emperor. When Antiochus finally died, his daughter Kinthera was taken to the throne. Kinthera was then proclaimed Empress Kinthera II and rose to power in the year 119 of the Third Era, when she was just 15 years old. Her claim to the throne was supported by her fathers and Potema's younger brothers, King Sepphoris of Galain and King Magnus of Lilmoth. Her aunt Potema, however, did not support her claim and came to the Imperial city to denounce her claim by convincing the Outer Council that she was an illegitimate child, because apparently Antiochus' wife, the Empress, had also been fucking around the Imperial city just like her husband. And Potema said that we couldn't be sure that Antiochus was actually her father, and that Uriel, her son, should be crowned emperor since he was the legitimate child of the second oldest child of Pelagius. The Elder Council, however, wasn't impressed, and with the help of her uncles, Sepphoris and Magnus, Kinthera was able to banish Potema from the imperial court. Kinthera was then crowned and arrangements were made for her to marry a certain Lord Modulus, who was to be her husband. All seemed well, but the banished Potema wasn't about to let her banishment and the rejection of her son's claim to the throne slide. She used her influence and loyalty that she'd garnered during her brother's reign to pit nobles against Kinthera. And in late 120 of the Third Era, she and her son Uriel gathered their armies and attacked parts of northern Tamriel. Many of the lords in the area were on their side, allowing their armies to march over their lands, and the Imperial legions in these regions were overwhelmed, and it did not take long before they held a significant part of Skyrim and northern High Rock. Uriel's forces swept across Skyrim until the entire province, including parts of northwestern Morrowind, were under their control. Uriel then starts to amass his forces at the border with Cyrodiil, seemingly waiting for a moment to strike at the Imperial province, where Kinthera still resided. At the same time of this attack, Potema's forces swept across High Rock until most of northern High Rock was under their control. She then opened a large-scale offensive on the loyalist Imperial kingdoms in southwestern High Rock, advancing all the way to Glenpoint. The Duke of Glenpoint then calls upon Empress Kinthera for reinforcements, afraid of not being able to hold the area for much longer, and Kinthera decides to grant him the reinforcements, and in an attempt to boost morale, she decides to lead the reinforcements herself, leaving her fiancé, Lord Modulus, in control of the Imperial city. However, all of this was just one big clever plot by Potema, since the Duke of Glenpoint was on her side, and she was able to assassinate the generals of Kinthera's army by night, and she was able to capture Kinthera herself in the castle of Glenpoint with the help of the Duke. The loyalist army in High Rock, now leaderless, was annihilated at Glenpoint, giving Potema's forces free rein in southern High Rock. However, that had just been part 1 of her scheme. The second part of her scheme was that several weeks after Kintra's departure to Glenpoint, she had forged a letter and had it delivered to Lord Modulus, supposedly written by Kintra herself, asking for reinforcements at Glenpoint, since the battle there was not going well for Kintra. Of course, Kintra hadn't even arrived there yet, but this was just a letter given by Potema. Lord Modulus wanted to help his bride-to-be and immediately set out with a large garrison towards High Rock, but as said before, this letter was a fake, and the army headed by Lord Modulus was ambushed in the mountains of Hammerfell. The fact that he even left the Imperial City itself ill-defended, and this weakness was used by Potema's son Uriel to quickly take the Imperial City and northern Cyrodiil. Modulus did not die here in Hammerfell after his defeat in the mountains, but he was forced on a retreat and he would die later in the skirmishes of Morrowind. After Uriel's taking of the Imperial City in the year 121 of the Third Era, less than a year after the start of the war, Uriel crowned himself Emperor, Uriel Septim III. With his cousin Kintra captured, he and Potema assumed that they had won the war and that Tamriel would soon be fully under their control. But that wasn't the case, as at Kintra's capture, her uncles, King Sepphoris of Galain and Magnus of Lilmoth, swore to end Uriel's rebellion, and they managed to rally a lot of the southern states of Tamriel to their cause, making it so that if Uriel wanted control of all of Tamriel, he'd have to fight for it. But first, the fight would be brought to him himself, as Sepphoris and Magnus opened 2 simultaneous offensives on Uriel's territory. Sepphoris massed his forces in Hammerfell and attacked southern High Rock. Meanwhile, Magnus rallied an army of Argonians and crossed through the mostly neutral Morrowind with the aim of attacking Skyrim. Both offensives had great initial success, with Magnus' mostly Argonian forces making it all the way into Skyrim after having fought through eastern Morrowind. However, the Argonians weren't used to fighting in winter conditions, while Nordic troops loyal to Uriel were. So during the winter, Magnus was forced to retreat back south to await the next summer and regroup his forces, else his armies would have been annihilated. Sepphoris, on the other hand, had made pretty decent progress in High Rock, although slow progress, but he kept holding on the offensive. This situation lasted for several years, until at the end, forces in High Rock had come to a standstill. Over the last years, Magnus has attempted to basically invade Skyrim several times, but all of them hadn't been huge successes, as he'd been limited to the summer months. However, in the year 127 of the Third Era, 7 years after the start of the war, the front started to move again. During the past 7 years of war, much had happened, but none of it had unfortunately been documented, so I can't tell you much of what happened during these years. We do know, however, that during these years, Lord Modulus, Kintra's former fiancé, died while defending a fort somewhere in Morrowind, and Kintra herself died in captivity as well. Some say that she was executed, while others are vague on the matter, so we don't know exactly what happened to Kintra, but somewhere during the war she died in captivity. During these years, Uriel had also consolidated his reign in his conquered provinces, but he was never able to open a full-on assault on the rest of Tamriel, as his armies were always busy to defend against Sepphoris and Magnus on their eastern and western fronts. However, after more than 6 years of war, Uriel was finally strong enough to open a large-scale offensive on his own. His forces crossed from Skyrim into Hammerfell with the goal of luring Sepphoris' forces out of High Rock so that he could fully recapture it and then defeat Sepphoris' forces in the plains of Ichidak in Hammerfell. This plan seemed to work, as Sepphoris was forced to basically turn to Hammerfell with some of his forces so he wouldn't be cut off from the rest of the Loyalist Empire. Sepphoris and Uriel then met each other in battle on the plains of Ichidak, and Uriel seemed to have the advantage, but in a twist of fate, Sepphoris managed to defeat Uriel's forces and even capture Uriel himself. The capture of Uriel was a huge blow to Potema, who at the time of this offensive was defending against the forces of Magnus on the eastern front in Skyrim. Her situation wasn't ideal, and she would have to quickly defeat Magnus now, since with Sepphoris now having a free hand in Hammerfell and High Rock, she faced an invasion of Skyrim from both the east and west instead of just from the east. She riled up her troops and in a stroke of luck managed to defeat Magnus' forces in Skyrim, together with one of her top generals, Lord Fokkan, forcing Magnus' forces back into Morrowind. But in the long run, this little victory did not matter, as Emperor Uriel Septim III died in captivity. The death of the Emperor caused many of those loyal to Potema to leave her side and rejoin the loyalist part of the Empire. Potema's allies fractured, and Skyrim was then invaded from all sides. As the Imperial army invaded Skyrim, her allies all left her eventually, and then she stood alone in the Kingdom of Solitude, where she was still queen. She would there fight on alone, descending into madness eventually, employing Daedra, necromancers, zombies to fight for her. Like that, she would fight on another few decades until Solitude was a virtual land of the dead, and after several decades the city was finally captured by Sepphoris and Potema died. But as Potema's hold up in Solitude, the war was officially won, and Potema in Solitude was no longer a large danger to the Empire. The War of the Red Diamond, as the conflict would come to be called, had ended, and Sepphoris Septim, being older than Magnus, was appointed Emperor by the other council. He would have his work cut out for him, as healing Tamriel couldn't be easy after this large of a conflict. But you can hear all about that in my video on the Septim Dynasty I did together with Afardi. Alright, so that's the end of this video. I hope that you liked it. I put in some extra effort on the war maps and the character portraits, therefore this video took a bit longer to get out. That said, if you liked it, consider sticking around until the next Elder Scrolls lore video on this channel, which will launch next week, as usual. Before I end this, allow me to thank the people who make videos like these possible, especially these where I put in a bit of extra effort. The only reason I'm able to do is because of my patrons, who you can see now on screen. And allow me to vocally thank my top patrons, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Metalloid1v1, Gabriel Binda, Mr. Christmas and Mr. Para. These guys, along with the others on screen, make my weekly lore series possible. And if you want to be notified on the videos, click the bell icon while subscribing, or follow me on Twitter where I also post my videos. And with that, I wish to end this week's video. Oh boy, I'm tired after this one. See you next week.